And so what I wanted to do is kind of ground us today on what are they policing? Why have many people that I know chosen to use that term? And why we decided to connect it with this idea of policing and the structure of policing. Because I think exactly what you said, people have an experience where like policing feels negative because it has been negative for many of us, right? When we come and we listen to BALT talk about the fact that this was a system that has murdered our people. So what we're going to talk about today is one, that the child, I'm going to use air quotes, welfare system is a choice. It's a policy choice. It's a system. Any system is policies, it's laws. That's different than whether we hurt, harm each other. So how we treat each other is different than what are the policies, what are the laws that say they address those issues. So one, we're going to say this quote unquote welfare system is a policy choice. Two, I hope by that point, I'm going to build some thinking that maybe we're in a little bit of a mess. Then I'm going to talk about why many of us on this call or myself, we have been in community with people that are in lots of other communities that call it the family policing system. And why I think as the questions here you all raised already, that is a system that impacts people like policing systems, actually connected to each other. And we're going to talk about the impact. So I think many of y'all brought up, like, it's about what it does. Like, I don't care as much about the name, but what it does, right? But we do want to name something about what it does. So if it protects people, we want to say it's protecting people. If it's caring for people, we want to say it's caring for people. If it's policing for people, we want to call it what it is. Because activist Rafiq says, is like, we can't fight a system if we don't know what the system is doing, right? All right, can we go to the next slide? So as a value that we all share is that we believe that families should be able to decide how and when they are a family. I will never say, invite your mom to your birthday. If you don't get along with your mom, that's on you. But I think it's very different than the state telling you who gets to be in and out of your family, who you get to live with, who you get to be with. So our value is we as a community, families as a community, our communities should be the ones to decide how and when we get to be together. You go to the next slide. But this child welfare system is a policy that allows, that legalizes the state to become a parent in our society. It says, hey, government, you get to have even greater roles than your mama, than your grandma. You get to act like a parent to the community. Next slide. And it is a policy, a set of laws, it's a choice. Our child, quote unquote, welfare system is a choice. And so they say we get to decide and we get to legally become your parents. And now we get to control the money, the budget, right? And if you look on the right side, Maryland, like every other state and our federal government, says the way we want to parent, they're the states as the parent, the policy as the parent. They say the way we decide and when we want to spend our money is we want to put most of our money in our budget for separating families. So think of like you had a bank account, right? And you're saving one portion for this thing, another portion for this thing. The child, quote unquote, welfare system is a legal system to act as a state parent that then budgets the vast amount of its money as its parent to become the actual entity that can separate families. Yes.
I had a question. I'm gonna give an example, and I don't know if it's fit anybody else, Roger, or whatever you got going on.
Can I pause you one second? I think we're gonna do questions in two ways. Beth, can you gather questions? Because we're gonna do a question and answer section at the end of this part with people on Zoom or not. I know it's a little awkward because in real life, normally I would pause for the question, but because we have people on Zoom, we have to do it at one time. So I'm gonna have Beth gather your question. So anyone
I'll make sure to
question,
divert to you all first, Erin. They're at the food project, and then take questions on Zoom.
Perfect, thank you. You can go to the next slide. If you have a question, raise your hand. Beth right here is going to take your question. So not only do they got a little bit of money, they got big money on this. So in 2019, according to the audit, they spent $153 million on programs just related to kids that were separated from their families. Imagine if that was the money that they were giving to keep families together, or the money that our state was investing in our neighborhoods, in our communities, all the different places. And this is a budget that they can't touch to do anything else but removals. Go to the next slide. And what's important to understand is that this is a benefit from the government. So if they were giving it to me, they would call it welfare. Yeah. But they call it a subsidy. And if you are someone who is fostering a child, you get in Maryland about at least $887 a month. And it doesn't, yes, per child. And does not matter, it does not matter if you are rich or poor. So what's important to understand is that for decades, in particular, Black and brown women have been fighting for child tax credits. We've been fighting for extra money to take care of our families, right? They keep telling us, oh, we don't got the money. There ain't no money. No, the state acting as a parent does have the money. And in fact, they have estimated this is the cost in addition to whatever you make to raise a child, but they only give that money when they separate families. So they know how much money it might cost, but they don't give it to people who are keeping their families together. They give it to people who are separating. Remember, this is the state as a parent, right? Next slide. You know the next slide. And when we think about what this system does, right? Because the whole point of why we were kind of going back and forth, like, what does it do? Well, it says that it's protecting kids. It says child protective services. It says it's serving the welfare of the kids. It's child welfare. It says it's taking care of people, foster care. But I don't think you can turn on any radio any day. They're talking about the lawsuits, right? Because actually, it hasn't done a very good job of any of those things. So when you look at, and we talked about this before, the difference between what are laws, things happening, that's a good question. Oh, no. And versus what does it mean to protect people from the actual harm, not what we create, what Marcus is going to talk to us about how to change and how to do, because like any law can be changed. What we're seeing is that young people, parents, fathers, mothers, caretakers, they're being hurt by the system. They're not experiencing protection. They're not experiencing welfare. That doesn't mean that nobody has ever felt support. But when we talk about what systems, we want systems to help the majority of people, not one or two people. So oftentimes when you hear about systems, people will raise their hand and say, well, this one time it helped me. I'm glad that it did. That's amazing that it did. And I don't want to take that away from anyone. But we're talking about the choice to have a system that is spending millions of dollars on separating families and is actually not protecting those kids. The next slide. Keep going. I'm not going to go through all these slides. Next one. Next one. But what I'm here to also say is that this is the way it was designed. So we call it, and I've learned to call it, the family policing system or the family destruction system or the family regulation system, because like our criminal policing system, it comes from a long history of American policies. Next slide. So our country was founded on policy choices, on legal choices of family separation. There was entire economies built on selling Black and brown children and taking them from people's wombs. That is embedded in our society. And in fact, we had very different rules of chattel slavery here in the United States, where it said once you had a child here, they would would never be able to be free. When we think about the way the family policing system works, once it's hit your family once, they pull up your record over and over and over again. And people think that's normal. We think it's normal because we live in a society that has said that is normal. It's normal to keep Black people, brown people, poor people in places where forever they can't get as much as someone else. And we see that also embedded in society of Black people being in our society, having their families separated. We've also been fighting to get our families back. So you'll see newspaper articles where families have written to their families to find their families. So also we have been in a place of always trying to reclaim our family. Well, the next slide. Well, as soon as they abolished slavery, there were ways that they changed slavery and policies to create opportunities for there still to be control over Black poor people, right? And one of the ways that they did this was to continue strategies of family separation. Initially, they actually didn't care that much about Black people. They just arrested Black children. They didn't really believe Black children and parents were even deserving of the type of oppression that the system has. They were jailing them and putting them in prisons, but they were taking in children that weren't considered to be white yet, immigrant children, and they were saying their parents who were poor were making them poor because they were poor as parents. So as if this is something you can like pass on as a trait, like hair color or eye color, I can just pass on poverty, right? And so this idea was that it would take these kids and give them to who? White Christian families to have these kids, right? And people were concerned, understandably. This was a newspaper clipping from the time this was all happening. People were like, this is a new slavery. So this isn't just my opinion, it's not my thought. It's like 1899. Yeah, I don't know that for sure, but I can find it for you for sure because I have it for sure. All right, can you go to the next slide? And then it wasn't just these children. The actual system we call child welfare system, the workers, the same workers that were happening now, they're like their grandparent workers, right? Like 3, 4, 5 generations ago. They would go to Native reservations and places where Native people were living, and they would take their children specifically to what they would call to quote unquote tame the savage from the Indians. Why? Because they knew that the fastest way to change people was to push them into white society, to push them into a family where they will be raised by white people, where they will go to schools, where they will be forced to no longer learn their language, have their customs, to be forced into a model of society, right? And this was, again, you don't have to take my word for it. The federal government created laws saying this was a genocidal project. This was a project of the child welfare system. This is just what happened. Next slide. And
Also,
then,
Erin, just sorry to interrupt, just unmuting about a time check. Andy said we got
okay,
about
great.
5 minutes.
Oh, perfect. I thought I was at time. I was like, oh, I can go real fast then. All right, so then in around the 50s and 60s, when Black people fought again to get their rights, right? You were supposed to get our rights, we didn't get our rights. Soon after that, and they said, okay, we actually can't keep welfare from Black people. We have to give them money too. All of a sudden, guess what happened to welfare? It went into the family policing system. So remember we talked about the state being a parent and the state having a budget? They started to take that budget that was going to other people and put it into this family policing system. They then also started the war on drugs. People talk a lot about the criminal policing system being just kind of invigorated by the war on drugs, right? With low-level arrests, with marijuana arrests, just kind of locking everyone up. What people often don't talk about is actually the war on drugs was also targeting, in particular, Black families. And so at the very same time as bills like the crime bill were being passed, at the very same time as they were taking away from welfare, they also passed this law called the Adoption Safe Families Act, which changed the way that they thought about families and what they had to do to start terminating rights quickly. And they put, remember that kind of like budget we talked about? Between 1982 and 2003, there was a 20,000% increase in the amount of money that states and would get to separate families. At the same time, we're asking for things like more cash assistance, SNAP benefits, housing vouchers, public housing, 20,000% increase of money. And people know oftentimes that these ideas of like the violent crime bill and the super predator and the 90s and all the caging and mass incarceration, people know that all of that was racist. But somehow we say, oh, but those same exact politicians were not racist in the child welfare system. All of a sudden, they cared about kids when they were calling them super predators in one place. Go to the next slide. And so what has happened is that Black families in particular have really been hurt by these policies. In Maryland, we know that Black children are 2.3% times more likely to be taken from their parents than a white kid. Next slide. And in fact, Maryland has the second highest amount, second only to Washington, D.C., of Black kids in their system. Next slide. I don't know off the top of my head, but I can find out. Get the slide, I'll give it to you. And we also know that there has been, in the last kind of 5 years, Black kids also aren't coming home. Next slide. And I think there's two ways to think about this problem. I know what I think, but I'm not here to tell you what to think. I am here to try to like convince, but you can take what you think. When you look at those numbers of over 50% of the Maryland foster system population is Black, you either have to say that's because Black parents, we as Black parents are worse parents, or because there's racism in it. You don't get that high amount of numbers either because people aren't doing something wrong or there's a structural issue at play. And I think it's really important to say that. Again, it's not because no one's ever done wrong in their life. It's not because I don't know someone who's done wrong in their life, right? It's not because Black people can't do wrong in their lives, right? But when we're talking about systems, we're talking about trends, we're talking about what's happening at a population level, what's happening at structure, right? Next slide. And we know that we look at these red areas, that the very same neighborhoods that are getting policed are the very same areas are getting their kids taken. This is also a map of people who are facing evictions, where that were red lines in Baltimore City. We look at Baltimore City redlining, we look at where people who are facing the most evictions, where you see red, those are the exact same zip codes where kids are getting removed.
So what's the top three?
Gotta go back. That's them for all. Gotta get questions. So, next one. And so we call this a policing system, not a welfare system. One, this idea comes from people who have been experiencing this system all over the country. And Brianna Harvey and Victoria Copeland thought of this idea of like, we need to actually be talking about the ways that the system is criminalizing and investigating. And here's what I say to people all the time. I know it's a policing system because I said to you right now, I'm sending CPS to your door. You wouldn't be like, thank you. I am so excited that I'm gonna get groceries tonight. You would be like, excuse my language, the fuck out of my face. If I said I'm sending them to your door, if you don't say thank you to me, then they're not protecting you.
Yeah.
Next slide. And they work together. So all of this is like, yes, they have the same function. They investigate, they surveil, they're in the same neighborhood, they criminalize, but they also literally work together. Since the 1970s, their actual relationships have become closer and closer together. They conduct joint investigations. They have special units. There are places in the States where they're actually having retired detectives train CPS workers. When they come to your house, it is the investigative unit. They come to investigate. Like, it's their investigative unit. Next slide.
And Erin, we're at time a bit.
Where are we at time?
Yeah.
Okay, then go, keep going to the last slide.
Last slide.
Oh, sorry, one
Slide
back.
before that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to pass. I think it's a great place for Natasha to come in about rights. But I do think people should follow these organizations to learn more, especially because I put a lot of facts and resources. And so you might want to fact check me. Happy to do that. Go to these places and find out more. All right. Thank you for that. And I'm going to dip out.
Okay. And I will definitely drop these in the chat so folks can see it as well. Thank you so much, Erin. So yeah, we're gonna, for time's sake, keep on moving along. And we have Natasha coming up next. Let me flip to some new slides here. All right, so I'll get you spotlighted, Natasha, and ready to go.
Thank you, Mel. Do I need to pull up my slide? Oh, nope, you
No,
got it.
I gotta
Okay.
just go back a few.
Good. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Natasha Khalfani. I am from the Better Together program. We are through the Office of the Public Defender. And I'll just pause just for a second.
Getting back there. Apologies.
No problem.
All right.
All right.
Okay,
So
and it
while
still started at the same part.
yeah. But you know what? Oh,
There we go. We're
okay.
there.
Yeah. All right. And I am going to briefly go through your rights as a parent if you are ever to come in contact with CPS or find CPS at your door. Next slide. So I want to briefly introduce myself and the Better Together program, and then we're going to navigate through the CPS investigation and what your rights are. At the end of this, I am hoping that you will be familiar with the CPS investigation process and know how to respond if you ever encounter CPS. Next slide. So as I stated, my name is Natasha Khalfani. I have been representing parents and children at one time or another in the child in need of assistance proceeding. That is where the court hears cases involving children in the foster care system. I have been representing families in that system for 16 years now. Very recently, the Office of the Public Defender started the Better Together program, which is a pre-petition early advocacy program. What that means is we provide legal services, social services, and parent support to parents who are under CPS investigation and or at risk of CPS investigation. Our goal is to protect parents' rights with the overall mission of keeping families together and preventing court involvement whenever possible. We are a multidisciplinary team, and you will hear more about our program in the breakout session, but we have a licensed social worker, which is different from the caseworkers that families often encounter when they are involved with the family policing system. And we also have a parent advocate who has lived experience navigating the system, as well as attorneys. Next slide. So why should you know your rights? We feel that this is important because when you don't know your rights, you are vulnerable to your rights being violated and your freedoms being protected. And I would argue that our number one liberty is the right to parent our children and the right to family integrity. And as Erin stated before, that the family policing system mirrors the police system, in the sense that while the motto, and we all have heard the motto of protect and serve, family policing will also say that their motto is serving and protecting and strengthening the families and looking out for the best interests of children. When people of color and when poor people encounter those systems, that is not what we feel. Those systems are there to surveil and invoke fear. And when we interact with them, we are often traumatized and experience a level of violence. And so it is important that you know your rights, so that you can protect your rights and protect your family. Next slide. So when we talk about the family policing system, these are the, I would say, the units within that system that I am referring to specifically in this presentation. So the Department of Human Services, which is the large organization here in Maryland, and that organization consists of the Department of Social Services, which consists of Child Protective Services, which is the unit in social services that most people are familiar with. That is the unit responsible for doing investigations and separating children from their families. Within that unit, you may also come in contact with the alternative response or family separation unit, which is supposed to function differently, but very much feels the same in terms of surveilling families, and then mandated reporters, which are all of the professionals that are required by law to make reports of suspected child abuse and or neglect. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but these are the common reasons that calls to CPS are made. I will highlight one of the issues that people are not as aware of, and people will push back when we say this, but domestic violence is a reason that children get removed from homes. So in situations where children are taken care of, all of their needs are being met, but there is domestic violence in the home, those children can and are often taken even from the victim of the abuse. And that is what the law calls failure to protect. And so you need to be aware that even if your children are perfectly taken care of, if there is a level of violence in the home, you are still vulnerable to CPS coming in and disrupting your family. So this is a very overarching view of the CPS and the investigation process. We're going to go through it in a little more detail, but I want to bring your attention to column number 4, investigations concluded. So after CPS does their investigation, there are 3 different possible outcomes that occur after that investigation. One is indicated, which means that the investigator found enough evidence to suggest that some level of abuse or neglect occurred. There's unsubstantiated, which means that they couldn't determine one way or the other whether abuse or neglect occurred, they just don't know. And ruled out, which means that there was not enough to determine that any level of abuse or neglect occurred, or they know that abuse or neglect did not occur. Within that, though, there's 2 things that can happen if there is suspected abuse and neglect, and that is 1, family separation. And I'm using the term suspected abuse and or neglect very loosely. The definitions of those 2 things, especially neglect, is very broad. And so when I'm using the term, I'm using it in the way that the law defines it. So if there is a finding of indicated, family separation often occurs and court involvement often pursues. However, there is something called hidden foster care in which CPS can force you or pressure you into sending your children to live somewhere else without the oversight of the court, which is a huge problem. And so that is something that you want to be aware of if you come in contact with CPS. So what happens during this investigation? First, the local department accepts a call from anyone in the community. Anyone in the community can make a call alleging abuse or neglect. If CPS decides that the allegations sound credible, then they can decide to do an investigation or an alternative response. If they decide to do an investigation, they refer the case to the Child Protective Service investigator and notify local law enforcement. That is very important. When a CPS investigator comes to your home, law enforcement is also notified that there have been allegations. If the allegation is for physical or sexual abuse, then the department has 24 hours to start an investigation. If the allegation is for neglect, the department has 5 days to begin their investigation. And those time frames are very important, and we'll get into that shortly. So when you're thinking about the CPS investigation, and Erin touched on this, I want you to think about the CPS worker as like a detective. Their job is literally in the name. Their job is to investigate you. And within that, the law allows them the opportunity to speak with anyone who may have information regarding abuse or neglect, including your children, the police, healthcare providers, school officials, etc. So I'm going to read straight from this slide because the law, and again, I'm speaking from the standpoint of an attorney at this point. The law gives CPS and DSS certain rights. So what is supposed to happen during an investigation? 1, a worker is to assess the immediate safety and risk of maltreatment of the alleged victim and of the children who are household or family members of the alleged victim or in the care and custody of the alleged maltreater. What that is saying is that they are going out to your home to determine whether there's a safety risk of not just the child that was reported, but any child in the household and any child under the care of the person they've determined to be the maltreater or the abuser. Number 2, determine if the alleged child abuse or neglect or any other child abuse or neglect is indicated, unsubstantiated, or ruled out. So they may come in to investigate one thing. Through their investigation, they determine something else is abuse or neglect. They can make a determination based on that other information. Determine what services, if any, are appropriate and make referrals as needed. Initiate shelter care, center proceeding, or voluntary placements as appropriate. And if possible, determine the identity of the maltreater. And that is coming straight from Maryland regulations. So that is what's supposed to happen when CPS knocks on your door. Next slide. So what should you know? And again, this comes straight out of the regulation. So it is important. This is part of why it's important to know your rights. If a CPS investigator comes to your door, they are required to show you identification. That is a requirement according to the law. There is no choice there. At the beginning of the investigation, the CPS worker is required to tell you what the allegations are and what the investigation process is. So not only are they supposed to tell you why they are there, they are supposed to also explain to you what is going to happen through this investigation process. And if CPS worker believes that your child is in immediate danger, The law allows them and requires that they make arrangements for the child's safety in the least traumatic, least disruptive way. So if a CPS worker is coming to you and the first thing out of their mouth is, we need to remove, then you need to question, how is that the least traumatic and least disruptive way to ensure my child's safety? Next slide. So what should you know if you're facing a CPS investigation? Things that you should know, and we'll get into whether you should permit these things or not. Things that I want you to be aware of. The social worker can speak, again, according to regulations, the law gives them the right to speak with your child or children without your permission, especially if it's considered an emergency or high-risk situation. So a worker has the right, according to the law, to go to your child's school without you knowing. You can, if a worker comes to your door and says, I want to speak to your child, you can refuse. However, they can call the police and get access to your child if it is an emergency or high-risk situation. Something else that you should know, everything you, your child, your relative, anyone in your house says to a social worker can and will be used against you in court. When I was representing parents on the post-petition side after their family was in court, one thing that I heard a lot of is, I didn't know that they were going to report that. When I said that, I was just trying to get help. I didn't know that they would use that against me. Everything you say to a social worker can and will be used against you in court if you find yourself court involved. And last, CPS keeps records of all past referrals, investigations, and cases. And they use that information against you when they come to do a new investigation. So if you had a case, a CPS investigation 2 years ago, and they're knocking on your door in 2025, that CPS worker, even if it's a different worker, they know that you had a previous investigation, and they are using that information in their decision-making process. Next slide. So what are your rights? You have the right to speak with an attorney before an investigation begins. Remember, they have 24 hours to do an investigation if there is an abuse or a neglect allegation. However, 75% of CPS cases are based on neglect, which means they have 5 days to start an investigation if the allegations are based in neglect. They also have 60 days to complete their investigation. So what that means is you have time to say, I want to speak to an attorney before we move on with this conversation, or before I answer any questions, or before I sign any documents. And you have the right and the time and space to do that. You have the right to refuse to speak to a CPS worker. This will not stop the investigation, but you do have the right, whether or not you want to have a conversation with them, what questions you want to answer and what questions you don't want to answer, what information you want to divulge. That is your right. And lastly, the one that most people don't know, you have the right to refuse entry into your home. Again, especially when the allegations are rooted in neglect and your child, the department is not there because they believe your child is in immediate risk of harm. You have the right to refuse entry into your home. You do not have to let them in. Next slide. And I will say that's equally as that is very important because, again, this is a policing system. As I stated before, when that allegation comes in, social services has already notified the police that there's an allegation against you. And so when you let that worker into your home, they are able to collect evidence that a police officer would not be able to collect when they come to your home without a warrant. So this is a very good way for the police to bypass the laws that state that they have to have a warrant and they have to do certain things to protect your rights, where the law does not make those same mandates on CPS. So you want to make sure when you are talking to workers, you are very clear. This is an investigation, regardless of what they say. Everything that they do is about collecting evidence against you, and that evidence can be used against you via in court in a civil case or in a criminal case. You have the right to refuse to sign any documents. So very often, DSS will make promises to not take away your children or to not file papers in court if you sign a safety plan or if you agree to do X, Y, and Z. You have the right to refuse to sign any documents without first speaking to an attorney. And even after you speak with an attorney, you don't have to sign those documents. You have the right to make arrangements for your children to stay with a trusted friend or relative. Remember, the law does give CPS workers the right to remove a child if they feel that that child is in immediate risk of harm. And so if that becomes the case, you are still the parent. So you have the right to make plans for your child to be in the care of someone else if they cannot be in your care. And lastly, you have the right to have someone with you while you speak with any DSS representative. This is very important because we often see parents being pressured to be by themselves when they're talking to a DSS worker. In those instances, you have to understand that that is their preference. That is not an obligation that you have. You have the right to have anyone present with you during the investigation, during conversations that you have with a CPS worker that you feel will be supportive in the process. Next slide. So if CPS comes to your home, what should you do? First and foremost, get the worker's first and last name and contact information and ask to see their ID. Anyone that comes to your home that you don't know who they are, you instinctively will ask, who are you and why are you here? That should be no different for someone who is identifying themselves as a CPS worker. Who are you? Why are you here? That means you're asking what the allegations are against you. And I will say, make sure you write that information down. So they knock on your door, you open the door, they identify themselves, you keep them at that door, close the door behind you, go get a pen and paper, come back, open the door, write down their name, their first and last name, and their contact information. Next, you're going to ask if this is an emergency situation, because you remember that if it's an emergency situation, different rules apply in certain circumstances. So you want to know upfront, is this an emergency situation? Do you think my child is in immediate risk of harm? If they say yes, ask what they need to address their concern. So is this an emergency situation? Yes. What do you need to make sure to know that my child is safe in my home right now? If they say no, tell them you would like time to contact an attorney to get advice and or more information. And remember, you're doing this after you find out what the allegations are against you, so you have as much information as possible to take to an attorney or to someone you trust and get informed advice. More steps you can take. So the Better Together
Natasha,
program.
I'm sorry to interrupt, just a time check. We're at time.
Okay. So I would just say the Better Together program is a program that is specifically designed to offer the legal services and other information that you may need to help you navigate a CPS investigation. We are in Baltimore City and County, but if you don't have that program in your area, please contact an attorney or someone that can help navigate that situation. And I think we can stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natasha. All right, I'm gonna stop share here.
Hi, everybody. This has been a really beautiful conversation. I'm sorry y'all, the Zoom world, weren't able to hear all the beautiful things that happened, but it was really amazing. One thing I would just like to say is that we can continue this conversation. People are coming together, Maryland Families Together. Follow them on Instagram, talk to them. We do want to build different things and we want to do this in community. So if people want to keep talking, let us know and come talk more. And I think we can drop that in. All right, I'll kick it over to Natasha.
I would just ask, if you know families that are struggling, even if they just need some direction, feel free to contact the Better Together program. I am going to echo what Erin said about Maryland Families Together. We are trying to build a coalition led by impacted parents. The Office of the Public Defender does do a lot of policy work surrounding the family policing system. And while our ultimate goal is abolition, until we get there, we are trying to continuously chop at and trim and attack the limitless power that CPS has on families of color and poor families. And so one of the ways to get involved in that policy work is to be a part of Maryland Families Together. And we are trying to really mobilize around impacted people and make sure that the right voices are being heard and the narrative is being changed around what the family policing system really is. So thank you. Happy to be here. Look forward to further conversations.
Mel, can I add one more thing?
Sure.
I will give Mel my email. People want to email me. Civil Rights Corp doesn't do direct representation, like we won't go to court. But we are really interested in learning more, especially if you had an eviction and a housing and a CPS case at the same time. We can't promise that anything will happen, that we can change it, that will make it different, but we are trying really hard. And so want to just kind of put that out there too.
Thank you all for coming. Looking forward to talk soon and enjoy the rest of your evening.